So since yesterday I tried to brainstorm a bit more so that I have more material. So yesterday I only did 3 questions and now I added some more material that I can get started with plotting. Like I already mentioned yesterday, today I want to look at the plot embryo method. I am aware of the plot embryo method, have been for a longer time. I think that's also like 4 or 5 years now, right? When it first came out, and I do know that it's based on the, I think it's called Story Circle, right? Story Circle. Yeah, exactly. So Dan Harmon's Story Circle, which also is based on the hero's journey, if I remember it correctly. So it's basically a method based on a method based on a method based on old storytellers who knew what they were doing, if I get it correctly. For this, we're still sticking with the Authortube video because it's an Authortube series, but since this other resource very much is kind of like the foundation, maybe let's peek into there as well.
I'm talking about is Dan Harmon's plot embryo, and you might have already seen a diagram and kind of illustrating it like this before. I am sure that I reblogged this graphic to my Tumblr kind of book blog thing like years ago, and it looks quite unassuming, but I actually found that when I grew to understand how it worked, and it kind of blew my mind a wee bit. But in some ways it actually takes a wee bit to get the hang of it, and I've just learned about it, so you know, I did as much reading as I could possibly find on it.
Okay, so what I don't really get is what is the difference between the plot embryo and the story circle? So that's maybe something that we can look at in a moment once I did the method and then compare it with the other and if it's the exact same thing, which is a new name, or if there are elements in there that she added herself. I think it's her thing, right? The plot embryo. I'm not completely sure, or if she's using someone else's method that is based on Dan Harmon's method. Another thing to find out. Cool, thank you.
Circle is divided in half horizontally and vertically, and these segments represent different things in the story universe. So the vertical line divides the internal change in the story, so the character. On the right you have stasis or ignorance, and on the left you have change or enlightenment. And these are going to be different depending on what story you're telling. Dan himself actually says in a lot of his plots in Community, these are dishonesty and honesty. The horizontal line divides external changes in the story, so the hero's world. On the top you have life, you have order, the familiar, and on the bottom you have death and chaos, disorder, and the unfamiliar. So these two lines give you kind of cardinal crossing points. If you're going clockwise, at number 3 you're going to cross from the familiar into the unfamiliar, kind of enter the story world, and at 5 you're going to cross from ignorant to enlightened, so the character is going to learn something, like which is...
Okay, so at 5 that would be then the critical moment where the character overcomes their flaw or learns about their flaw, probably.
The point of the story. And then over at 7, you're going to cross from the unfamiliar back into the familiar, so you're going to return home.
I need some sort of diagram to do this, right? Is there like resources? Okay, now I'm being just lazy, but maybe there's like something that I can use. My best resources, free course, how to plot on 1 page, the story magic, monthly live stream, plot embryo printable. Here, is that paid resource? Yeah, okay. No, I'm not willing to pay 25. What is it? Is it pounds? Dollars? Very good with money. Dan's explanation. I want to do this first before I go to the other resource. Okay, I'm just going to use PowerPoint. So now that I have it, so I have the familiar, I have the unfamiliar, the ignorance and the enlightenment. Let's go with the classics and then see how the story goes.
So number 1, you have a character in a zone of comfort and you're establishing your protagonist here.
Okay, so who is the protagonist? That's kind of a bit of a problem because so far I settled on the idea that I want to have a multi-point of view character story. I have to learn how to say that word. have multiple characters be protagonists. So every chapter or whatever, let's go with chapter, every chapter has their own protagonist that tells one part of the story, and it's really more about telling the overall story in terms of, we have future wartime travel, it's about the future war in this future storyline, and it's really about how did it start, how did we get to the point where they do time travel. So it's really the prequel to the present storyline, which is the actual story that I want to tell. So the present storyline it's called Not the Chosen One, or that's the working title, because it's about a not chosen character. And based on that, I do know a few things that would play into the future storyline, or rather what has to happen in the future storyline so that the present storyline works, which is, first of all, there has to be a chosen one. And second is that I know that in the present storyline, I want to tell the story of a sibling of a chosen one. So that means, and it's a fairly, when we first meet the characters in the present storyline, they're like, you know, the typical standard 10-year-old kind of child that gets discovered as some sort of chosen one, and then the actual story plays probably when that person is between 20 to 30 years old. So the main conflict happens in the future storyline. So that's why I know that there's a chosen one in the future storyline who is probably around 30 years old, and that there is the sibling aspect, but the sibling aspect doesn't really play into this future storyline. So that's kind of the idea here, that I want to have like the future storyline where you have these characters that play out the chosen one story, but the actual protagonist of the present storyline doesn't really matter in that future storyline. So he's just kind of like, you know, a passing character. And I like the idea of that, to have passing characters in this future storyline that in the present become then the protagonists. I know all of this is a lot of explanation. I'm pretty sure that you don't really care that much about the story that I'm working on, because this is really more about trying out a method, and obviously you're doing your own thing. But this is just to give some sort of, you know, kind of setup for why now I have to figure out who the character is and how to do that. How do you do that when you have several characters? So maybe it's a good idea to look at it from the perspective of the overall story, right? So the story is really how did humanity get to the brink of extinction? So by that logic, I could say that the overall protagonist is really humanity as a whole. And the characters in the chapters, they are really the stand-ins part of that overall protagonist. So in that case, we establish who the character is, right? Humanity as a whole. And what else do I need to establish? Just who is the character? Do I also need to establish their weakness or their status quo, right? What's humanity is, maybe this sounds a bit weird to say it like that, but humanity is living peacefully, that you don't spell peacefully, peacefully as a pig. Okay, that sounds a bit weird putting it like that, but it's basically saying that there's a planet, there are humans living on it, and they are the dominant species. That would have been a better word than apex predator. That sounds a bit very dramatic, but kind of like establishing that, you know, kind of a similar world than our world, probably not actually our world, but just like a copy of it, where humans are the dominant species, just so that then when this other threat comes, it's very much a shock to the system.
You show that the character needs or wants something. They're in a zone of comfort, but something's not quite right. And number 3, they go off on their adventure. They go off to seek the thing they want. They cross from the threshold of, you know, the ordinary world into the story world. And that might be fantastical or not.
Okay, so for them to want something, the fruit flies invasion would have already had to take place, right? So they need to do something because something happened. So they live peacefully, and then at need they get attacked by. So number 2 is the need is they now have been attacked by something they know nothing about what it is. It's really just some sort of silent kind of creepy phenomenon that escalates quicker and quicker while they try to figure out what it is. So they need to find out what it is, and now they go somewhere, right? So where do they go? They started out in a familiar world and then they go into the unfamiliar. So what if I do that in the actual literal sense? So we say we have the human world, we start out there and then go over into the unfamiliar world. So the threat has to come from somewhere, right? It's supposed to be an alien threat, not necessarily coming from the sky, but it does come from outer world. So they go into the other world. Go to the other world to find out what is attacking them. And there, that's the question. So if it's the overall story of humanity, you have a few people going into the other world, but then you also have the ones staying in their own world trying to defend themselves. So do I tell now 2 stories? So do I have 2 storylines happening? And at some point I also have to introduce the chosen one. That's another constraint from the present storyline, because for the present storyline to happen, they need to know that there is a chosen one. Otherwise it doesn't work like that. So in the future, they have to meet this character, whoever it is that takes a message back, probably some sort of time travel agents. And they have to know that this person is special enough to become a focus point in the present storyline when they still can prevent the fruit flies invasion. So probably I have to have 2 storylines. I'm just going to write down both of them and then see if I can use both of them. Or if I have to go with, maybe just follow the ones who go off-world, and then when they come back, they see what happened in the meantime. Not sure there yet. So far, I have to say the method is very useful, right? I mean, it's very straightforward. It kind of has this intuitive feel to it. So it's not at this point in the story at page blah, 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 you have to have like the central conflict being set up or stuff like that. It's not formulaic in that sense. It's really more kind of like intuitive. Similar to, the Toy Story formula. Not Toy Story, sorry, Pixar formula. How did it go? So this one is also very intuitive. I also like that one. It's basically, you have a situation, all the time it's like this, and then one day this happens, and because of that, because of that, because of that. So feels similar to that. So it's kind of like, it's based on that point before. So it's really a chain and not just formulaic. So I like it.
And number 4, they search for the thing. So they go through the mode of trials, as it's called. They're forced to adapt to the unfamiliar. It's a kind of cleansing through fire, basically preparing them to get what they want. So at number 5, you've got find. They find the thing they want. Dan uses the same term as Joseph Campbell on this and calls it meeting the goddess. It's a moment of stillness.
What do they go and search? In one storyline, they're looking for, search for info on how to defeat them. And in the other storyline, it's trials, right? So it's really just, there it should escalate probably at this point. So before they went into war, and now this is the point where something goes wrong, right? Or where they lose the main battle and are on retreat. So the idea kind of is there. One of my main inspirations for this story is Edge of Tomorrow. And in Edge of Tomorrow, I really liked this whole tone set up of, you have like this one last stand from humanity, and then when it fails, they lose everything. I really liked that part. So I kind of like the idea of having a moment like that, where they went into the battle or whatever it is with all their forces and still lost. Okay, but coming back to find.
Vulnerability and revelation. This is where they cross from ignorance into enlightenment.
So it's the moment where they realize what they're dealing with is much stronger than them, or much more equipped to what it's doing. So what it could be that so far in the story they thought that it was maybe like, I don't know, it was not a coordinated attack, for example, or it was like you know, kind of like a zombie thing where it's basically they are infected by something and then they become brainless. And this could be the point where they realize the enemy is actually smart and organized, and that could happen in the second storyline, like in the war storyline, right? So there, the realization that the enemy is organized and smart, or just kind of realizing that it's an actual thinking enemy, whereas before they just thought it was kind of like a natural thing or whatever. Whereas in the storyline where they're off-world, there they would find, well, actually they could find two things there. They could, on one hand, they could find the time travel, because we still have to find the time travel. So far, I had a few options which I brainstormed yesterday on how to deal with the time travel. One of them was basically that humans could always do it, but I don't like that. I don't like the idea of time travel already being in the human world and being a thing, because two things. First of all, if humans can time travel, they would have used it a ton in the past, and there are a lot of other conflict that would stem from them. So that just tells a different story than I want to tell, so it would just divert away attention to what I actually want to be the story. The other thing is that it would really take away from the conflict, because if humans can time travel and have like magic or whatever that gives them that ability, why are they losing so badly, right? They should be much better at defending themselves if they have like those higher powers. So that's why it makes more sense that the time travel is introduced from the threat, because that's the other thing that I really don't like. Obviously, I don't want time travel to be invented while they're being attacked. That seems so unlikely. Like, it's first you have like this alien attack of a thing that you didn't even know existed, didn't even know there were other worlds, and at that moment you're also inventing time travel. Seems so unlikely. So time travel has to be linked to the same thing that causes the invasion in the first place. So here I like the idea of it not being a generally natural thing. So for example, I don't want it to be like timelines where you just walk from one world into the other, and because of time difference that causes the time travel. Because I'm really attached to the idea that it would be something where people can shift back in their own bodies back to their younger selves, and that's the time travel. This way I can use that element to tell that the story that I want to tell in the present storyline is supposed to be a communication between the present storyline and the future storyline, and how the present affects the future, you know, kind of like working together. That only works if I use that method, I think. So that's why right now I'm thinking about doing it like that. That means it has to be attached to a person. And the idea would be that they go into a different world, come across some method that gives specific individuals the ability to time travel, not everyone. And there, the limit could already be that you obviously need someone in the present storyline who is at the right age. So everybody in the future storyline who's like below, what was the time difference? I think about 20 years. So everyone who's younger than 20 years, obviously not a good idea. And everybody who's too old might be very useful in the present storyline because they're exactly the right age. Kind of like that, right? So those constraints are already there, but it also makes sense to limit on who exactly can use time travel, how often it can be used, and so on. That's all stuff that has to come much later. But that's the idea. So they basically find the time travel thing at here, and at the same time they also need the realization. So the others realize that they're organized and smart. And I would like the idea that the ones in the other world at the same time realize that this is not the first time that this has happened. Maybe the time travel comes from another world where there's a much more advanced civilization, and that civilization had the time travel, but they also lost to the fruit flies, and that's the realization, right, at this moment, that they're so far out of their depth. Okay, last three.
Whatever their initial state was to whatever they've now learned or how they've changed. They make a choice here, and then they start to ascend. At number 6, they take what they wanted. So they found it, and now they take it, and they pay a high price for it. So this is where they meet their maker. It might be even called the all is lost moment. This is about sacrifice and cost. It's the low point. But the character has now changed. Instead of being reactive in the first segment of the circle, they're now active. So at 7 you have the return. So they cross from the unfamiliar back into the familiar. And this might be, you know, a big car chase, they might be escaping, extracting, or it might be very low key. And then
okay, so problem. That intuitively I would think that at the take moment, if that is the all is lost moment, then taking the time travel comes with sacrifices to whoever has gone there. So if it's a team, then only one person comes back with the time travel and everybody else died. That could be one way to go, but if every chapter is about a different character, then it's anyway, every moment seems a bit like that, especially coming back to the first video, which was deciding on the theme, right? Right now the theme would be, what do you live for? Kind of, what is it worth to live for? What is it worth dying for? Kind of playing into that. And every character has to have kind of a challenge, a decision point that plays into that theme. So every character potentially dies, and that's why we shift over into a different viewpoint. I like that approach. So, but by that logic, then it's really, that moment happens over and over again. So it's not really a all is lost moment anymore when we get to take. So what happens at take? So the obvious thing is that they take the time travel and they lose something, right? But what do they lose? I don't know that yet. And for the in-world conflict, there it could be that some resistance has to decide to, that plays into the overall theme, right? Where it's the ones who are still capable, now that they lost that main attack, that main battle, the ones who are still capable now have to start making the decision to keep saving themselves rather than trying to help other people. And this would be, I imagine it an all is lost moment, in the sense that this is the moment where humanity as a whole, you know, kind of like the planet and the different countries and cities and so on, they realize that they have lost and that they're on their own. Kind of like that message starts to spread, maybe breakdown of communication, and where it's really that realization spreading, kind of like that. Okay, so, and then return. Return is also, since I'm very literal here, is basically coming back from the other world. World with the time travel. And what happens in the other storyline? What was return?
So they cross from the unfamiliar back into the familiar. And this might be, you know, a big car chase, they might be escaping, extracting, or it might be very low key.
Okay, I don't really get that point in this explanation. So return is about, before it was, so status quo, familiar was, we're living in our world, everything is fine. And then they were thrust into this other thing, right? And then they're coming back to the familiar. So it's obvious in one storyline they're coming back into their own world. But what happens to the others? They have to get a new sense of familiarity, right? So maybe this is where the new resistance, the last human resistance sort of starts to organize. So I don't really envision it as a sort of like superset of military organization, but rather the last of humanity, whoever is left that is still in contact with the other world group. You're now promoted to resistance.
So the character has returned to the familiar, but they're now changed. You know, they now, having changed, have the power to change things. So they can change the status quo. They're now able
Okay, and then that would be the point where the two storylines merge back together. And we're left with humans, surviving humans. So yeah, so what changed is that they now have some limited information. This would be probably at the point where in the future storyline they are about to be wiped out. So that's why they don't have a lot of time to find out more information. But this would be the point where some volunteers who get the time travel ability go back into the present storyline, and that's where the present storyline kicks off and where the communication between present storyline and whoever's left in the future line starts to happen, right? Okay, so cool. I actually, like I said, I do really like this method. Very intuitive, very easy to figure out kind of at what point what has to happen. The point that I struggled with the most, I would say, is definitely the return. Not completely sure, you know, in my story sense, if I'm getting that right. And also the find and the search seems to be still a bit the same thing. It's not really a change between them. So that would have to be more detailed. Should we look at the comments first, or should we go to the other resource and compare? Let's start with the comments, so to finish off this video, and then I want to look at the other resource and maybe just see if there's additional anything in there that I can use. Definitely agree with this. This video here had a lot less exposition than the video yesterday, which I very much appreciate, and also obviously the chapters and the structure of showing kind of it's a very visual model to begin with, right? So that's definitely a plus here, and just kind of explaining the different points and then being able to copy that, right? This comment here is really interesting for two reasons, because first of all, the thing with the plot points mirroring each other, that's something that she gets into here at a later point in the video. I haven't covered it now because looking at it, it's something that I'm not advanced enough yet with this story. It's kind of like the symmetry between the story, you know, when you go first, you start off kind of like this thing where it's like, you know, here at you are basically one version of the character, and then at find, the character changes because of what they found. So this kind of symmetry, she gets into that more in depth, and it's definitely something interesting to look at and also to work out. Right now I'm not doing it because I feel that the thing that I have here is very much still too much of a blueprint to get too much into the analysis part. Again, that word, I'm pretty sure you don't say it like that. So something that I want to revisit later on when I'm more sure about if that is the plot that I'm going with. And the other thing that this comment mentions is exactly what I said before, right? The Pixar method feels very similar to the Pixar method in the sense of you're going by the point before, so very intuitive. And that's something else that maybe you have some opinion on that, because I'm not very experienced with it, but I feel like this method that we're using right now, the plot embryo or the Pixar method, those are very good methods when you are trying to figure out what the plot could be, like at the stage where I'm at right now, whereas other plotting methods seem to me much more about you have the finished story, you even have it drafted, and it's figuring out about how to clean it up, make it more easy for the reader to digest or whatever. So for example, like those story beat techniques, right? Or the save the cat approach. Those things for me, they are too formulaic at this point in the story, but would be useful maybe at an editing stage. So I would be really interested in having some opinions on that. If you are experienced with kind of like those story beat techniques, how do you use them? And if you use them now at the beginning stage, is it because you have more of kind of like a market approach? You know, you kind of like know exactly what the end product of the story should be, and that's why it works? Or can you also do it like here? Obviously I have a story that is very generic, very familiar in terms of what kind of story it is, right? But right now it feels very much like a lump of clay, and it can still be formed into completely different kinds of story versions. Whereas market approach, I mean, for example, I would imagine if you had like a formulaic, I don't know, erotica novel or romance novel that follows the same plot beats all the time, that would be probably the kind of story that I would use a method like Save the Cat for, because you already know what the end product is, whereas here I don't necessarily know yet what the end product is. So yeah, sorry, a lot of explanation again, but if you have anything there that could be useful, please share. That's also something here with this comment that I haven't really touched on yet. Obviously, her plot method is based on another method, right? And that is based on another method. I don't necessarily mind it when it's not someone's original method, because I also very much like the kind of seeing different takes of different methods, seeing the discussion part, seeing interpretations. That's also what I'm kind of trying to do here when trying out these things, to build up on the existing, to make it that it fits me, and so to customize it for myself. So I really like to see suggestions on how other people are doing it. So yeah, that's kind of like also something that I very much agree with. But I think there's not much anything else that I need to consider in terms of more input or how to do this method differently. From what I see here from the comments, it's really also more people sharing how they used it, and seems to be similar thoughts as to what I already arrived at. So instead of that, let's go to the story circle video. So yeah, I really like this video as an explanation, as an example of how to use the story circle. I'm not going to play the whole thing because this video is already way too long, but obviously you can find it. I'll link it below if you want to have an example while you're doing this. Studio Binder is actually also another resource that I really like. I've watched a few of their videos. It's very much, a lot of it is about filmmaking, but there's also a lot about storytelling in there. So there are pretty good resources there. And like you can see here, I mean, there are so many kind of story circle or plot embryo methods being suggested. Obviously, I'm not going to try everything, but seems like this method has been very much already talked about and customized and so on. And so there's like a lot of really cool free video resources to use as the input, right? Studio Binder, their website, they also have a template on how to do the story circle with some nice explanations as well. From what I saw here, you have to sign up with your email to get this whole booklet for free. So if you're looking for a template, maybe this is an option for you. No collaborations, no sponsoring, no affiliation at all. I just found it. Personally, I'm just going to stick with my own PowerPoint because, like I said, I don't think you need any templates for this method. It's very much kind of like you need the circle, and then all the explanations seem to be abundant on YouTube and on websites like that. So yeah, I think this is actually everything, right? When it comes to here. This time I really feel like I made progress, to be honest. This time is the first time that I feel like I have some actual material now to work with to make it into a story and not just into premise after premise after premise. So this time I now have something to work with. So definitely a success in terms of this video. Very useful resource, good starting point for anyone who's trying to figure out the basic plot of their story or what it could be. I'm kind of at the crossroads because I don't know if I want to go into plot deeper now and figure out like the exact details, or if I want to focus first on finding the characters and figuring out who they should be. So if you want to find out on which of the two I decide on, you can watch this video here next, which will have a decision, hopefully.